I stood there while my father calmly explained why my brother deserved the house, the business, and the future I helped build, and in that moment, I understood something that took me years to accept: that silence does not protect the good-hearted. It only rewards the cruel until someone finally decides to walk away and take their power back. Please take a moment to subscribe to Nillavoices, where unheard stories finally find a voice. Your support keeps these stories alive, and your presence here truly matters. My name is Genesis. And when my father cleared his throat at the head of the dining table and folded his hands like a man preparing to bless a meal, I still believed. The meeting was about logistics, timelines, maybe even shared leadership, because hope had trained me to misread warning signs my whole life. This isn't easy to say, my father said, looking straight at Ethan, not at me. And I nodded automatically because I had learned that agreement was safer than questions. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, "You don't have to make it dramatic, Dad, just say it." And the way he smiled made my stomach tighten. My father inhaled slowly and said, after a lot of thought, "I've decided the house and the business will go to Ethan, because he's better positioned to carry the family forward." I waited for my name to follow his sentence, for a pause that meant there was more. And when none came, I asked softly, "And me?" Because my voice had always learned how to sound small. My father finally looked at me and said, "Genesis, you've been a great support, and that matters more than you realize." And the word support landed like an eraser dragged across years of work. My mother stared at her hands and whispered, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," which hurt more than silence because it sounded like blame. Ethan shrugged and said, "You'll still have a place here. Nothing really changes." And I almost laughed at how easily he said that. I said, "I helped build this." And my father replied, "And you did a wonderful job," which somehow avoided answering me completely. Ethan tapped the table and said, "Dad's right. You're amazing at behind-the-scenes stuff." And my chest tightened as if that was supposed to be a compliment. I remembered being 16, standing beside my father in the workshop while he explained numbers and contracts, telling me I was smart, but not once telling me I was worthy. "Genesis," my father said, lowering his voice, "this isn't about fairness, it's about stability." And I wondered when stability became a reason to exclude me. I asked, "Was this decided already?" And my mother flinched while Ethan stayed silent, which answered me faster than words. My father said, "We've talked about it for a while." And something inside me cracked quietly, because that meant every meeting, every late night, every sacrifice came with an invisible ceiling. Ethan finally said, "You know, Dad's always seen me as the leader," and I stared at him, wondering how entitlement could sound so calm. I said, "I thought effort mattered," and my father replied, "It does," then added, "in different ways," which felt like a door closing gently but permanently. When the meeting ended, Ethan stood and said, "No hard feelings." And I nodded because I had practiced that nod my entire life. As I walked out, my mother whispered, "I love you," and I wanted to ask why love never showed up when it mattered. That night I sat alone and said out loud, "They planned this." And for the first time, the truth stopped hurting because it finally made sense. I called Maya and said, "They didn't even hesitate," and she answered, "Because they never questioned it," which made me press my forehead against the wall. I told her, "He thanked me for support like I was furniture," and she said, "You're not invisible, they're just comfortable ignoring you." I whispered, "I keep thinking I missed something," and Maya replied, "You missed nothing. They missed you," and that sentence felt heavier than anything my family said. I replayed my father's voice in my head and asked myself, when did approval become my goal instead of respect? And the silence answered back. Maya said, "This didn't start today," and I said, "I know." Because suddenly every memory lined up to perfectly. I remembered holidays where Ethan spoke, and I listened, meetings where my ideas passed through his mouth to sound acceptable, and dinners where my mother changed the subject when tension appeared. "Genesis," Maya said, "you don't lose anything. That was never given freely," and I cried because she was right. I ended the call and looked around my apartment, realizing how small my world had become while I tried to fit inside theirs. I said to myself, "They decided long ago," and for the first time, hope stopped arguing back. That realization settled slowly inside me, not as rage or revenge, but as clarity that my life would have to change now completely. I used to think being overlooked happened suddenly, but the truth revealed itself slowly. The way silence spreads when people decide your voice is no longer necessary. Why wasn't I invited to the meeting? I asked one morning, standing in my father's office doorway while Ethan shuffled papers like my question was background noise. Ethan didn't look up and said, "It was short notice." And I nodded even though the calendar reminder on my phone said otherwise. Later that week I asked my father, "Did I miss something important?" And he sighed before replying, "Genesis, not everything requires your input." I said, "I've handled those accounts for years," and he answered, "You're taking this personally," which felt like another door quietly closing. Claire appeared more often after that, leaning against Ethan's desk and saying things like, "Maybe you should focus on what you're good at," with a smile that never reached her eyes. I replied once, "I'm good at running this place." And she laughed softly and said, "That's cute," which stayed with me longer than it should have. Ben avoided my gaze whenever numbers were discussed, and then when I finally cornered him near the printer and asked, "Did something change?" he whispered, "I just follow instructions," before walking away. Meetings kept happening without me, and when I asked Ethan about it, he said, "You've been busy lately," even though I sat at my desk every morning waiting to be needed. I went to my father and said, "I feel like I'm disappearing here," and he replied, "You're being dramatic," which somehow made my chest feel hollow. One afternoon I found my name removed from a project file and replaced with Ethan's. And when I asked him, he said, "It was easier this way." As if he's justified erasure, I said that was my work, and he shrugged before answering, "We're a team." And I realized teams only matter when power is shared. Claire once told me, "People don't see leaders in you." And I asked, "Who decides that?" But she just smiled and said, "Results." I started doubting memories that once felt solid, wondering if my contributions were imagined, or if confidence was something I never learned to perform correctly. Maya noticed the change before I admitted it and asked, "Why do you sound smaller?" And I told her, "Because I'm learning how not to be noticed." She said, "That's not survival." And I replied, "It feels safer," even though my voice shook when I said it. My father praised Ethan openly, saying things like, "You have a natural authority," while telling me privately, "Support roles are valuable too." I asked him once, "Do you believe I could lead?" And he paused long enough for the answer to hurt before saying, "That's not the path I see for you." Ben finally spoke one evening and said, "I don't like how this looks," and I asked, "Then why let it happen?" And he whispered, "Because I have bills." That honesty broke something fragile inside me, because it meant my invisibility was convenient, not accidental. I stayed late that night, staring at spreadsheets that no longer carried my name, and I said out loud, "I don't exist here anymore." Maya called and asked, "Are you okay?" And I answered, "I'm still here," but the lie tasted bitter. I cried quietly in my car, not because they pushed me out, but because I finally understood they never planned to let me stay. I said to myself, "If I remain, I will disappear completely." And admitting that truth hurt more than leaving ever could, I went back inside the office building and found my father locking his door. And I said, "I need you to hear me," while my hands trembled. He replied, "This again," and I said, "I am vanishing in a place I helped build." And he looked tired than concerned. He said, "You're imagining patterns that aren't there," and I answered, "Then explain why my work has your son's name." He hesitated before saying, "Ethan handles pressure better," and I asked, "Or does he just get believed faster?" My mother called later and whispered, "Please stop fighting this," and I asked, "Why?" and she said, "Because it won't change." I sat on my apartment floor and told Maya, "Staying is costing me my voice," and she said, "Then leaving might save it." I closed my eyes and admitted, "I am shrinking to survive," and hearing it aloud felt like a truth I could no longer ignore. I didn't wake up angry that morning. I woke up tired in a way that felt final. The kind of exhaustion that settles in your bones when you realize no amount of effort will ever earn what was never meant to be given. Maya sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You look empty," and I replied, "I feel relieved," which surprised both of us. She leaned forward and asked, "Relieved from what?" And I said, from trying to convince people who already decided I don't matter. Maya said, you used to walk into rooms like you belong there. And I answered, I was trained out of that. And hearing it aloud felt like naming an injury. My phone buzzed then. And when I saw Ben's name I hesitated before answering, because fear had become my reflex. He said quietly, I shouldn't be calling you, and I replied, then don't, but my voice shook anyway. Ben paused and said, some numbers don't line up. And I asked what kind of numbers. While gripping the edge of the table, he lowered his voice further and said, the kind that look fine until you trace them. And my stomach tightened. I said, why are you telling me? And he answered, because you're the only one who would ask why. And that sentence stayed with me. Maya watched my face and said, something just changed, and I nodded because it had. Ben emailed files later that afternoon, and as I scrolled through them I whispered, this doesn't make sense, over and over again. Maya asked, is it bad? And I said, it's careful, which felt worse. I stared at the screen and said, he didn't just take my place, he hid behind it, and my hands trembled. Maya said, you don't have to protect them, and I replied, I know, but my voice broke anyway. That night I sat in my car outside a small office and said, I'm just here for information, like I needed permission even then. Sarah greeted me calmly and said, tell me what you're afraid of, and I answered, finding out I was right. She listened without interrupting while I said, I don't want revenge, I want clarity. And she nodded slowly. Sarah said, truth doesn't destroy families, lies do. And I felt something loosen in my chest. When I left, I sat in the car and said, I'm allowed to know. And for the first time I believed it. The next evening I went to my father's house and said, I need to talk to you alone. And my voice didn't ask. He sighed and replied, this again? And I said, no, this ends tonight. I placed the documents on the table and said, explain these, while my heart pounded. He glanced at them and said, you don't understand business, and I answered, then explain it to me. He looked away and said, Ethan handles things differently, and I replied, differently or dishonestly. Silence filled the room, thick and revealing. My father finally said, you're going to tear this family apart. And I answered, you already did. He stood and said, you're overstepping, and I replied, I stopped asking permission. My mother appeared in the doorway and whispered, please, and I said, I can't keep disappearing for your peace. My father said, if you walk away now, don't come back, and I looked at him and said, I already left. I walked out with shaking hands but steady steps, and the night air felt sharp and honest. Maya called and asked, did you do it? And I said, I chose myself, and tears finally came. She said, that's not rebellion, and I replied, it's survival. I sat alone afterward and whispered, I don't need approval to exist, and the words stayed with me. For the first time, distance felt safer than hope, and I let it be enough. I didn't find out everything at once, because consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly through emails, court letters, and phone calls that stop getting returned. Maya called me first and said, did you hear? And I replied, about what? Even though my body already knew. She said, Ethan's name is everywhere right now, and I asked, everywhere where? While staring at my ceiling, legal places. She answered, the kind that don't go away. And I closed my eyes without smiling. Ben texted later and wrote, I'm sorry it came to this. And I replied, it came because it had to. He called me and said, they're asking questions, and I answered, they should. Because calm had finally replaced fear. Ben hesitated before saying, your father keeps asking where you are, and I replied, he knows. Even though I hadn't spoken to him, Ethan never called me, not once. And that silence said more than any apology could have. Claire disappeared from conversations the way she once appeared in them, sudden and strategic, and I noticed without satisfaction. Maya asked, do you feel vindicated? And I said, I feel finished, which surprised me. She laughed softly and said, that sounds healthier. And I agreed. Sarah called and said, things are progressing exactly as expected, and I asked, what does that mean for me? She replied, nothing changes unless you want it to, and I said, that's the first time someone said that. I ran into my father unexpectedly at a grocery store, and he looked smaller than I remembered. He said, we need to talk, and I replied, I'm listening. Without stopping my cart, he asked, "Why didn't you warn us?" And I answered, "I tried for years." He said, "Your brother made mistakes." And I replied, "He made choices." My father sighed and said, "I thought I was protecting the family." And I looked at him and said, "You were protecting comfort." He asked, "Do you hate me?" And I answered honestly, "No, but I don't need you anymore." That sentence felt like setting down a heavy bag I had carried too long. Later that night my mother called and whispered, "I wish I had been braver." And I said, "I wish you had too." She cried and asked, "Can we fix this?" And I answered, "We can be honest," which was all I had left. The business fell apart without drama, not with explosions, but with audits, resignations, and quiet exits. Maya once asked, "Do you miss it?" And I replied, "I miss who I thought I could be there." She said, "And who are you now?" And I smiled before answering, "Someone who chooses herself." I built a smaller life, but it fit me, filled with mornings that didn't start with dread and evenings without apologies. I took a job where my ideas were heard, and when my boss said, "You should lead this," I believed him. Maya teased, "Look at you." And I replied, "I was always here." Sometimes I passed the old house and felt nothing but distance, which felt like peace. I said to myself, "He kept the house," and then added, "But I kept my voice." When Ethan's name stopped meaning power, I didn't celebrate because I didn't need to. My father sent one last message that said, "I'm proud of you," and I read it without answering. Not because I was cruel, but because I was complete. Maya asked, "Do you forgive them?" And I said, "I forgive myself for staying so long." At night I sometimes whispered, "I survived," and the words no longer shook. I learned that revenge is loud, but freedom is quiet, and I chose quiet every time.